In December 1941, the world was a powder keg. While the smoke was still rising from the ruins of Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia, the British Empire believed it possessed an insurance policy that no enemy would dare challenge. To deter the rising sun of Imperial Japan, Prime Minister Winston Churchill made a move of immense symbolic and military weight. He dispatched Force Z to Singapore. This task force was built around two of the most famous names in naval history: the battlecruiser HMS Repulse and the crown jewel of the Royal Navy, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales was not just a ship, she was a floating statement of British supremacy. A brand new King George V-class battleship, she was the pinnacle of mid-century engineering. Only months earlier, she had stood toe-to-toe with the Bismarck in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, and had later served as the grand stage where Churchill and Roosevelt signed the Atlantic Charter. She was equipped with 10 14-inch guns, a massive armor belt designed to withstand any shell in existence, and what was thought to be the most advanced anti-aircraft suite in the world. To the British public and the Admiralty, she was a super ship, a fortress that could move. Accompanying her was the HMS Repulse, an older but elegant battlecruiser known for her speed and grace. While she lacked the modern armor of her younger sister, the Repulse was a veteran with a crew that was among the best in the fleet. Together, these two giants were meant to be the fleet in being that would keep the Japanese at bay. The British High Command, steeped in centuries of naval tradition, suffered from a profound and fatal delusion. They believed that a modern battleship, bristling with heavy guns, was fundamentally invulnerable to air power while at sea. Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, the commander of Force Z, was a man who personified this naval orthodoxy. Known as Tom Thumb due to his short stature, he was a brilliant but rigid tactician who famously dismissed the threat of land-based bombers. He believed that the high-speed maneuvers of his ships, combined with the wall of steel provided by their anti-aircraft batteries, would render any aerial attack ineffective. In his mind, the airplane was a nuisance, not a ship killer. On December 8th, the news reached Singapore. Japanese forces were landing on the beaches of Malaya. The invasion of the British Far East had begun. Admiral Phillips didn't hesitate. Despite knowing that the Royal Air Force RAF in Singapore was depleted and unable to provide a constant fighter umbrella, he ordered Force Z to sea. His objective was to intercept the Japanese troopships and crush the invasion force before it could establish a foothold. As the two giants slipped out of Singapore's harbour, followed by their destroyer escorts, the tropical heat was suffocating. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of fuel oil. On board the Prince of Wales, the morale was high, almost arrogant. The sailors believed in the steel beneath their feet. They believed that no Oriental pilot could possibly threaten the pride of the King's Navy. But as they moved into the South China Sea, they were sailing into a trap. Admiral Phillips had made a series of critical assumptions that would soon prove catastrophic. He assumed the Japanese lacked modern torpedo technology. He assumed they wouldn't fly far from their bases in Indochina. And most importantly, he assumed that the thick clouds of the monsoon season would hide him. He was wrong on every count. Lurking beneath the waves was the Japanese submarine I-65. Through its periscope, the commander saw the massive silhouettes of the British capital ships cutting through the grey-green water. The message was flashed to Saigon. Force Z located. In the airbases of French Indochina, the elite pilots of the Genzan, Kanoya, and Mihoro air groups began to scramble. These were not the poorly trained pilots Phillips expected. They were veterans of the war in China, flying the Mitsubishi G4M Betty and the G3M Nell, bombers specifically modified to carry the most lethal aerial torpedoes in the world. As the sun began to rise on December 10, 1941, the radar operators on the Prince of Wales stared at their flickering screens. Multiple blips appeared from the north. The ghost of Pearl Harbor had followed them to the South China Sea. The drone of nearly 100 Japanese engines began to vibrate through the humid air, sounding like a funeral dirge for the Empire. Admiral Phillips stood on the bridge looking out at the horizon, still convinced his guns would win the day. He was about to witness the end of an era and the violent death of the myth of the invincible battleship. By 11 a.m. on December 10, 1941, the tropical tranquility of the South China Sea was shattered by a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives: the synchronized roar of 90 Mitsubishi G3M Nell and G4M Betty bombers. They appeared not as a disorganized rabble, but as disciplined V formations cutting through the monsoon haze like silver scalpels. On the bridge of the HMS Prince of Wales, Admiral Phillips and Captain Leach watched the sky. The ship's state-of-the-art Type 282 radar had picked them up, and the fire control computers were already humming, calculating lead times for the massive anti-aircraft batteries. But there was a problem that no one had anticipated. The intense tropical heat and humidity of the Malayan coast had begun to degrade the sensitive electronic components of the radar and the cooling systems for the 5.25-inch dual-purpose guns. The super ship was already starting to sweat under the pressure. The first wave of high-level bombers targeted the HMS Repulse. Captain William Tennant, a legendary seaman, watched the bombs fall from 10,000 feet. With a cool head, he ordered, "Harder starboard." The old battlecruiser twisted in the water, the bombs exploding in massive geysers just yards from her hull. Only one 250 kilos bomb struck home, crashing through the hangar deck and exploding in the Marine's mess. It was a serious hit, but the Repulse was a tough veteran. Her damage control teams doused the fires, and she remained at full combat speed. Then came the torpedoes. While the Repulse was busy dodging bombs, the elite Canoia Air Group focused their attention on the Prince of Wales. This was the moment the world had been waiting for, the ultimate test of the modern battleship against the modern airplane. The Japanese pilots performed a maneuver that defied British naval logic. They dove from the clouds, leveling out just 30 feet above the water, flying directly into the teeth of the battleship's concentrated fire. The Prince of Wales opened up with everything she had. The sky turned black with the smoke of hundreds of shells. The pom-pom multi-barreled cannons created a rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the very souls of the sailors below deck. Tracers zipped through the air like lethal fireflies, but the Japanese pilots didn't flinch. They dropped their torpedoes at a distance of only 800 yards. One torpedo, just one, changed the course of the war. It didn't hit the thick 14-inch armor belt. It struck the extreme stern on the port side, exactly where the outer propeller shaft exited the hull. The physics of the impact were catastrophic. The explosion didn't just punch a hole, it buckled the propeller shaft itself. Because the engines were still running at full speed, the bent shaft began to whip around inside the ship, like a giant berserk flail. In a matter of seconds, the spinning, mangled shaft tore apart the internal bulkheads, shredded the electrical conduits, and smashed the watertight seals. This was the Achilles heel of the King George V class design. Through the ruptured shaft tunnel, thousands of tons of seawater began to surge into the ship's electrical nerve center. The effect was instantaneous and paralyzing. On the bridge, the lights flickered and died. The communication telephones went silent. Most importantly, the power to the massive 5.25-inch anti-aircraft turrets failed. The wall of steel was suddenly cut in half. The guns that were supposed to protect the ship were now frozen in place, pointing uselessly at the sky as hand-cranked backup systems struggled to move their massive weight. The Prince of Wales, the pride of the Empire, began to take on a heavy list to port. Her speed dropped from 25 knots to a crawling 15. She was no longer a predator. She was a wounded titan, trailing oil and blood into the sea. Admiral Phillips, stunned by how quickly his invincible fortress had been crippled by a single hit, looked across the water at the Repulse. Captain Tennant on the Repulse, seeing his flagship in agony, broke radio silence to send the message that Phillips had stubbornly refused to send. "Enemy aircraft attacking. Send fighters." But it was too late. The second wave of Japanese bombers was already cresting the horizon, and they had seen the Prince of Wales slowing down. The hunters had found the scent of death, and they were closing in for the kill. By 11:45 a.m., the South China Sea had been transformed from a tropical paradise into a chaotic arena of industrial-scale slaughter. The air was a thick soup of cordite smoke, vaporized fuel, and the thunder of nearly 100 engines. The HMS Prince of Wales was already a broken giant, listing heavily to port and wallowing in the water like a wounded whale. Her complex electrical grid, the very nervous system of the ship, had been shattered by the mechanical trauma of the bent propeller shaft. She was no longer a battleship, she was a stationary target. But as the flagship foundered, the HMS Repulse was putting on a display of seamanship that would go down as one of the greatest defensive stands in naval history. Captain William Tennant, standing on the open bridge of the Repulse amidst a rain of jagged shrapnel and hot empty shell casings, was fighting a battle of pure intuition. He understood the physics of the Japanese aerial assault better than any man in the fleet. He ignored the screaming sirens and the roar of his own guns, instead gluing his binoculars to the horizon, tracking the Mitsubishi G3M Nell and G4M Betty bombers as they banked for their low-level runs. Every time he saw the distant splash of a torpedo being dropped into the sea, Tennant would count the seconds. He waited until the very last possible moment, until the white bubble streak of the torpedo was clearly visible through the green water, and then he would bark the order that saved his men over and over again, "Harder starboard," or "Harder port." The Repulse, though an old battlecruiser from a previous era, responded to his touch like a racehorse. She twisted and turned through the heavy swells, her massive wake carving deep white scars across the emerald sea as she narrowly evaded the high-explosive fish. It is estimated that Tennant successfully dodged 19 consecutive torpedoes in a row. The Japanese pilots, elite veterans who had expected an easy kill after crippling the Prince of Wales, were becoming visibly frustrated. They had never encountered a captain who could read their drops with such supernatural accuracy. But the Japanese were not just skilled, they were relentless and tactically brilliant. They realized that attacking the Repulse from a single side was a waste of ammunition. To break Tennant's defense, they began to employ the dreaded anvil attack. They split their formations, banking their planes so that torpedoes arrived at the ship simultaneously from both the port and starboard bows. It was a mathematical trap. No matter which way Tennant turned the ship, he would be turning directly into the path of another torpedo. At 12:22 p.m., the luck of the Repulse finally reached its breaking point. A wave of 8 torpedo bombers from the Kanoya Air Group closed in from multiple angles. Tennant managed to avoid the first 3, but the ship's momentum was exhausted. A torpedo smashed into the amidships on the port side, with a force that lifted the 32,000-ton ship partially out of the water. The explosion tore through the unarmored hull, flooding the boiler rooms and cutting the ship's speed. Moments later, another torpedo struck the extreme stern, jamming the rudder, the same fatal blow that had doomed the Bismarck and the Shinano. Within the next 3 minutes, 3 more torpedoes slammed into the Repulse. The ship was literally being hammered into the sea by 1,800-pound warheads. As the Repulse began to roll over with agonizing speed, Captain Tennant stayed on the bridge until the very last moment. He didn't need to give a formal order to abandon ship. The men clinging to the tilting deck already knew. In a final act of leadership that echoed through the ship's internal speakers, he called out, "All hands on deck, prepare to abandon ship. God be with you all." The Repulse rolled 90 degrees to port and stayed there for a few heartbeat-skipping seconds, her red-painted underbelly exposed to the tropical sun like the belly of a dead fish, before sliding stern-first into the depths. Out of her crew of 309 men, 513 went down with the ship, many trapped in the darkened engine rooms. The survivors were left bobbing in a thick, choking layer of black fuel oil, watching in frozen horror as the Japanese planes ignored them and turned their full, murderous attention back to the crippled and defenseless Prince of Wales. On the bridge of the flagship, Admiral Phillips and Captain Leach watched their only companion vanish beneath the waves. The Prince of Wales was now truly alone in the middle of a hostile ocean. Her anti-aircraft fire had dwindled to a pathetic, intermittent stutter. Because the electrical power was dead, the heavy 5.25-inch guns were being moved by hand cranks, a process so slow and physically demanding that the fast-moving Japanese bombers were long gone by the time the gun barrels were finally lined up. The Japanese pilots, seeing the great battleship motionless and defenseless, began to toy with their prey. They flew so low that the British sailors on the deck could see the goggles and even the facial expressions of the pilots. They raked the decks with machine gun fire, cutting down the crews of the exposed pom-pom guns who were desperately trying to reload. The wall of steel was gone. The myth of the battleship was dead. The Prince of Wales was now just a massive steel coffin, waiting for the final merciful blow to take her to the bottom. By 12:35 p.m., the HMS Prince of Wales was no longer a pride of the fleet. She was a floating charnel house. While the Repulse had vanished in a sudden, violent roll, the death of the flagship was a slow, agonizing process of disintegration. The ship was listing so heavily to port that her secondary 5.25-inch gun turrets were nearly dipping into the waves. Inside, the darkness was absolute. The seawater, fueled by the relentless pressure of the ship's own movement before she stopped, had flooded the primary electrical switchboards. The super ship was now a powerless hulk. Below decks, the scene was one of pure claustrophobic terror. Because the ventilation systems had failed, the temperature in the engine and boiler rooms rose to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Engineers and stokers worked in total darkness, illuminated only by the orange glow of emergency lanterns and the sparks of short-circuiting cables. They were chest-deep in a mixture of seawater and thick, slippery fuel oil, struggling to keep the remaining generators alive. They could hear the muffled thuds of more torpedoes hitting the hull, each impact sending a shockwave through the steel that felt like a giant's hammer. Then came the high-level bombers. The Japanese pilots, having exhausted their torpedoes, switched to heavy 500-kilo armor-piercing bombs. They didn't need to worry about anti-aircraft fire anymore. The Prince of Wales was silent. One massive bomb struck the center of the ship, crashing through several decks before exploding in the cinema flat. This was the ultimate tragedy within a tragedy. The cinema flat had been designated as the primary casualty station. Hundreds of wounded men, many already suffering from horrific burns and broken limbs from the initial torpedo strikes, were laid out on the deck being treated by surgeons. The bomb explosion turned the area into a furnace. The blast wave and the resulting fire killed almost everyone instantly. Those who survived the explosion were trapped in a labyrinth of smoke and twisted metal, with the water rising around them. On the bridge, Admiral Sir Tom Phillips finally faced the reality he had denied his entire career. He had watched the Repulse sink, and he now saw his own invincible battleship being torn apart by the very airplanes he had dismissed as toys. He was a man of the old Navy, and as the ship began to settle deeper into the water, he made a silent, stoic choice. He ordered the destroyer HMS Express to come alongside to take off the survivors. It was a perilous maneuver. The Express nudged its bow against the towering listing side of the battleship, while the Prince of Wales continued to roll. Hundreds of sailors began to slide down the barnacle-encrusted hull, jumping onto the deck of the destroyer or into the oil-slicked sea. Captain John Leach, the ship's commander, stood next to the admiral. Witnesses say they were perfectly calm, as if they were observing a naval exercise. Leach was heard shouting to the men jumping into the water, "Good luck, men! God bless you!" When the order was given to abandon ship, several officers approached Admiral Phillips, urging him to board the Express. He refused. He didn't even put on a life jacket. He stayed on the bridge, a tiny figure in a white uniform, standing at attention. He had led Force Z into a trap born of his own hubris, and he intended to stay with the 327 men who were still trapped in the bowels of his flagship. At 1:18 p.m., the Prince of Wales reached her tipping point. The massive battleship, the same ship that had carried Churchill to define the future of the free world, rolled completely over to port. For a few seconds, her giant 14-inch gun turrets, the symbols of an era that was now officially over, pointed toward the seabed. Then, with a sound like 1,000 freight trains crashing, she slipped beneath the waves. A massive air bubble erupted from the hull as she sank, throwing debris and oil hundreds of feet into the air. When the spray cleared, the South China Sea was empty of British capital ships. The invincible Force Z had been annihilated in less than 3 hours. As the HMS Express pulled away, packed with traumatized survivors, the Japanese planes did something unexpected. Instead of strafing the men in the water, they flew low, circled the site of the sinking, and then headed back to Saigon. Some survivors claimed they saw a Japanese pilot drop a wreath of flowers over the spot where the ships went down. A final, samurai-like salute to a defeated but brave enemy. The myth of the battleship was dead. The British Empire in the east was defenseless, and the world finally understood. The airplane was now the undisputed king of the ocean. The news of the disaster did not travel with the slow, rhythmic pace of a sinking ship. It struck the heart of the British government like a lightning bolt in the middle of a clear sky. In London, it was still the cold, grey, early hours of the morning on December 10th. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was still in bed at 10 Downing Street, surrounded by his usual mountains of wartime paperwork, when the telephone on his nightstand began to ring with an aggressive persistence. It was Sir Dudley Pound, the First Sea Lord. His voice, usually steady and authoritative, was trembling, sounding fragile and barely audible over the crackle and static of the long-distance line. "Prime Minister," Pound began, his voice cracking with a weight that Churchill instantly recognized as a harbinger of doom. "I have to report to you that both the Prince of Wales and the Repulse have been sunk by the Japanese. We believe most of the crews are lost, including Admiral Phillips." Churchill, the man who had unflinchingly faced the Blitz, the evacuation of Dunkirk and the darkest days of 1940, was momentarily paralyzed. The cigar-smoking titan of British resolve was reduced to a stunned silence. He later wrote in his memoirs about this exact moment, capturing a rare instance of total vulnerability. "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock. As I turned over and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me." For Churchill, this was not just a naval loss. It was a personal betrayal of his own strategic vision. The Prince of Wales was his favorite ship, his unsinkable ambassador. She was the vessel that had carried him across the Atlantic to meet Roosevelt, to draft the Atlantic Charter, the very blueprint for the post-war world. To Churchill, she represented the absolute continuity of the British Empire. Now she was a mangled wreck at the bottom of the South China Sea, and with her, Britain's centuries-old grip on the East had evaporated in a single morning. "Are you sure? Is there no mistake?" Churchill asked, clutching the receiver so hard his knuckles turned white. "There is no doubt," Pound replied. "The reports are coming from the destroyers. The air cover arrived too late. The ships are gone." The shock that paralyzed London was matched by a total, hysterical panic in Singapore. For decades, the British public and the colonial subjects had been fed a steady diet of propaganda. Singapore was the Gibraltar of the East, an impregnable fortress, a tropical shield that could never fall. The arrival of Force Z just days earlier had been orchestrated as a grand spectacle. There were parades, cheering crowds, and gala dinners. The residents believed they were safe behind the 14-inch guns of the Prince of Wales. When the first destroyers, the HMS Express and Electra, limped back into the harbour, the illusion of safety shattered instantly. The ships were packed with survivors who didn't look like the victors of a grand empire. They were covered from head to toe in thick, black, toxic fuel oil. Many were horribly burned, their skin peeling away in the humid air. They carried with them the smell of cordite and death. As these broken men were carried off the ships on stretchers, the civilian population of Singapore watched in a deathly silence. The invincible fleet was gone. The fortress was now a massive, defenseless target. The morale of the British, Australian, and Indian troops across the Malayan Peninsula did not just dip, it disintegrated. If the greatest, most modern battleships in the world could be swatted from the sky like common flies by Japanese planes, what hope did a foot soldier with a rifle have against the Japanese army? The psychological aura of the white man's invincibility in Asia, a cornerstone of colonial rule, was destroyed in 3 hours of aerial bombardment. The strategic implications were catastrophic beyond measure. With Force Z wiped off the map, the Japanese Imperial Navy held absolute unchallenged command of the sea. They no longer had to worry about British interference. They began to land troops wherever they pleased, moving through the impenetrable Malayan jungles, with terrifying speed using bicycles and light tanks. Across the Atlantic in the United States, the news was received with a grim, sobering realization. Pearl Harbor had been a surprise attack on a sleeping fleet, which gave the Americans an excuse for the disaster. But the Prince of Wales and Repulse had been at full combat readiness. They were at sea, their crews were at their guns, and they were actively seeking a fight. Their destruction proved a terrifying truth that naval traditionalists had spent decades trying to ignore. The age of the battleship was over. The battleship was now a prehistoric monster, and the carrier-borne aircraft was the new, undisputed king of the Pacific. In Tokyo, the reaction was the polar opposite. The sinking was hailed as the greatest victory since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. The pilots of the 22nd Air Flotilla were treated as demigods, their faces immortalized in newspapers and propaganda films. They had done the impossible. They had dismantled the prestige of the British Empire for the price of just a few dozen aircraft. Weeks later, the impregnable fortress of Singapore would surrender to a Japanese force half its size. It remains to this day the largest surrender in British military history. Over 80,000 troops marched into captivity, and every single one of them knew that the end had truly begun on that humid December morning, when the great oil slick appeared in the South China Sea. The shield of the empire was broken, the heart of the Navy was pierced, and the world had finally accepted that a new, terrifying era of warfare had arrived. For decades after the sinking, naval historians and engineers asked the same haunting question. How did the most modern battleship in the British inventory, a ship designed specifically to survive the horrors of modern naval combat, fall so quickly? The HMS Prince of Wales was not a relic, she was a technological marvel. Yet, when the pressure was applied, her invincible systems collapsed like a house of cards. The technical autopsy of Force Z reveals a terrifying truth. The ship was defeated by the very environment she was sent to protect. The first major failure was the tropical paralysis of the radar. The Prince of Wales was equipped with the Type 282 and Type 285 radar systems, designed to direct the anti-aircraft fire with mathematical precision. However, these systems were built and tested in the cold, crisp air of the North Atlantic. When the ship arrived in the South China Sea, the relentless 90% humidity and 100-degree heat began to wreak havoc on the delicate vacuum tubes and electrical components. By the time the Japanese planes appeared on the horizon, the battleship's eyes were partially blind. The radar sets were overheating and malfunctioning, forcing the gun crews to rely on manual, visual aiming, a task that was nearly impossible against fast-moving modern torpedo bombers. The second failure was the myth of the pom-pom wall of steel. The Prince of Wales was bristling with the famous QF 2-pounder pom-pom multi-barreled anti-aircraft guns. They were designed to create a literal curtain of lead. But there was a fatal flaw in their design. The ammunition was fed in fabric belts that frequently jammed in the humid tropical air. As the Japanese Betty and Nell bombers made their low-level runs, the pom-poms began to stutter and seize. Worse still, the guns were designed to track planes moving at 150 miles per hour, the standard speed of the 1930s. The Japanese pilots were attacking at over 200 miles per hour. The British gunners were literally chasing ghosts. By the time they turned their barrels to where the plane was already gone. But the most catastrophic failure was the electrical death spiral. As we discussed in Part 2, a single torpedo hit the port-outer propeller shaft. In a perfectly designed ship, this would have been a serious but survivable injury. However, on the Prince of Wales, the propeller shaft didn't just bend, it became a weapon of internal destruction. As the bent shaft continued to spin at hundreds of revolutions per minute, it acted like a giant blender, shredding the internal bulkheads and, crucially, severing the main electrical conduits that ran along the hull. Because the British had centralized much of the ship's power to save space and weight, the destruction of these cables caused a massive ship-wide power failure. In an instant, the smart ship became dumb. The heavy 5.25-inch dual-purpose turrets, which were the ship's primary defense against bombers, lost their electrical motors. These massive steel turrets, weighing many tons, suddenly had to be moved by hand cranks. It took over 20 seconds for a crew to turn the turret just a few degrees. Against an airplane that covers a mile in 15 seconds, the guns were useless. The supership was trapped in a technological paradox. The more advanced her systems were, the more vulnerable they became to a single point of failure. Without electricity, the pumps couldn't clear the water. Without electricity, the guns couldn't track the targets. Without electricity, the Prince of Wales was nothing more than 43,000 tons of inert steel. Admiral Phillips had gambled that his ship's technology would compensate for his lack of air cover. He didn't realize that his technology was already dying from the heat and humidity before the first torpedo was even dropped. The Japanese hadn't just attacked a battleship. They had attacked a flawed engineering concept, proving that in the new era of warfare, complexity was a weakness, and air power was the ultimate judge. By 1:10 p.m., the HMS Prince of Wales was no longer a warship. She was a listing, smoke-belching carcass under the unforgiving glare of the tropical sun. The giant was tilted more than 20 degrees to port, and the sea was already beginning to lick the edges of the main deck. It was in this nightmare scenario that the commander of the destroyer HMS Express, Captain Jack Cartwright, made a decision that defied every naval safety manual in existence. He ordered his small ship to pull directly alongside the towering, rolling hull of the sinking battleship. It was a suicidal maneuver. The Prince of Wales weighed 43,000 tons. The Express was a mere 1,300-ton tin can. If the battleship suddenly capsized, it would either crush the destroyer instantly or pull it down into the deep within a violent sinking vortex. Despite the risk, Cartwright maneuvered with millimetric precision, nudging the bow of the Express against the starboard side, the side still rising out of the water. What followed was a scene of unprecedented horror and bravery. Hundreds of sailors, many with their skin shredded by steam burns or coated in a thick, toxic layer of black fuel oil, began to slide down the barnacle-encrusted hull of the battleship. They tumbled directly onto the deck of the Express. Others, unable to reach the destroyer, leaped into the sea, which had become a black, choking soup of flammable oil. The oil was perhaps the cruelest enemy of all. It burned the eyes, blinding the swimmers. It entered the lungs, suffocating them from the inside. Men who had survived the violent torpedo explosions were now dying silently in the water, weighed down by the heavy sludge that made it impossible to stay afloat. Amidst this chaos, small acts of heroism shone through. Sailors who, despite their own wounds, held onto their comrades to prevent them from slipping into the massive, still-spinning propellers that were now rising out of the water like giant blades. While the HMS Express became so overcrowded with survivors that it struggled to maintain its own stability, the destroyer HMS Electra navigated through the debris field, pulling men from the water. Officers on the Electra reported that the sea was so hot from the explosions and the sun that the rescued men felt cooked to the touch. The silence that followed the end of the gunfire was broken only by the screams for help and the metallic groans of the Prince of Wales as her internal structure buckled under the weight of the ocean. In the final moment, as the battleship began its terminal roll, the HMS Express had to cut its lines and back away at full speed to avoid being dragged under. The men on the destroyer's deck looked back and saw Captain Leach and Admiral Phillips on the bridge, waving a final goodbye. They weren't just officers fulfilling the tradition of going down with the ship. They were the personification of a Royal Navy era that was being buried right then and there. Below deck, the fate was even darker. Hundreds of men were trapped in the engine rooms and lower compartments. Without electricity, the automatic watertight doors could not be opened. They died in absolute darkness, listening to the roar of the water invading the corridors, knowing that the most modern ship in the world had become their steel tomb. As the massive air bubble erupted on the surface, signaling that the Prince of Wales had finally hit the seabed, the Japanese planes circling above did something that left the survivors stunned. Instead of strafing the men in the water, a common practice in other theaters of war, the Japanese pilots lowered their flaps, slowed their engines, and flew low over the lifeboats. Some sailors swore they saw the pilots salute the survivors with samurai-like respect before disappearing over the horizon toward Saigon. The massacre was over, but the South China Sea would never be the same. The British Empire had lost its shield, and the men remaining in the water were the only witnesses to the end of an age. The sinking of the HMS Prince of Wales and the HMS Repulse was not just a naval engagement, it was a tectonic shift in the history of the world. As the last bubbles of air escaped the hull of the battleship and the massive, suffocating oil slick began to drift across the South China Sea, the British Empire in Asia effectively ceased to exist. The shield of the Commonwealth had been shattered in less than 3 hours, leaving the impregnable fortress of Singapore exposed, naked, and psychologically broken. Without Force Z to threaten their supply lines or bombard their landing zones, the Japanese Imperial Army moved with a terrifying predatory speed. They poured down the Malayan Peninsula, cycling through jungles that British commanders had deemed impassable for modern troops. The loss of the ships had created a vacuum of leadership and hope. Just weeks after the disaster at sea, on February 15, 1942, General Tomoyuki Yamashita accepted the unconditional surrender of Singapore from General Arthur Percival. Over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops were marched into brutal years-long captivity. It remains, to this day, the largest surrender in British military history. A direct, undeniable consequence of the moment, Admiral Phillips sailed his ships out of harbour without a single fighter plane to protect them. But the tragedy also marked the official, violent death of the battleship era. For centuries, the greatness of a nation was measured by the diameter of its battleship guns and the thickness of its steel armor. The battleship was the ultimate symbol of sovereign power. But after December 10, 1941, the world's admirals had to face a brutal new reality. A $50,000 airplane piloted by a motivated man could destroy a $50 million battleship in minutes. Naval architecture changed forever that afternoon. From that day forward, the aircraft carrier became the undisputed center of the fleet, and the battleship was relegated to a secondary role of shore bombardment, a prehistoric monster in a world of eagles. Today, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse rest in the dark, warm and silent waters off the coast of Kuantan, Malaysia. They lie as massive, rusted monuments to a vanished age. The Prince of Wales lies completely capsized, her 4 gargantuan propellers, the same ones that caused her internal destruction, pointing toward the surface at a depth of 68 meters. The Repulse rests on her port side nearby. They are officially designated as protected war graves by the United Kingdom. Under international law, it is strictly forbidden to disturb them, out of respect for the 840 men who remain entombed within their dark, pressurized steel hulls. They are not just wrecks, they are underwater cathedrals. However, in recent years, a new and disgusting tragedy has struck the site. Despite their protected status, illegal metal pirates have targeted the graves. Using massive cranes and illegal explosives, these scavengers have begun to tear apart the hulls to reach the high-quality pre-atomic steel forged before nuclear testing, which is highly valuable for sensitive scientific instruments. These pirates are literally desecrating the graves of heroes for scrap metal, ripping the ships apart piece by piece. It is a heartbreaking final chapter for vessels that once represented the absolute pride and majesty of a global empire. When we look back at the disaster of Force Z, we don't just see a tactical military defeat. We see the ultimate price of institutional hubris. We see the danger of a command structure that refuses to adapt to a changing world, choosing instead to believe in its own myths of invincibility. Admiral Phillips and his men were undeniably brave, and their ships were masterpieces of their time, but they were fighting a 20th century war with a 19th century mindset. They believed that steel was stronger than spirit, and that tradition was a shield against technology. As the tropical sun sets over the South China Sea, the long shadows of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse remain as a silent, submerged warning to all who believe they are untouchable. They remind us that the ocean is a merciless judge that does not care for titles or traditions. History has no pity for those who fail to see the horizon shifting. The Empire is gone, the guns are silent, and the ghosts of Force Z are finally at peace, buried in the deep, a final haunting requiem for the giants who fell from the sky.